I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for giving me time from your, I'm sure you're very busy and you already mentioned that you are outstation. Can you tell me a little bit what's going on right now on your side? Like, what are you doing? Is there anything significant that you're doing right now?
At the moment, I'm a little bit out the way. I'm in a rural area because I'm trying to isolate a little bit, trying. So I'm finishing up a book I started in so it's taken me this long to get around to actually finishing it. I've been putting it off, but it got to the point where I had to finish it. I don't know. With writing, it's one of the things where, how can I put it? It comes to a point with a book, it's like on your shoulder, and it's one of the things I need to just clear out the way so I can move on to other things. So I'm in isolation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank God it's not a COVID isolation, right? As long as it's a
No, I
productive
wouldn't.
isolation,
That
that's the
that would
best thing.
not. That would annoy me. Yeah, to put it politely.
Yeah. All right, coming back to the topic, I think for today we wanted to discuss a little bit about African culture and the importance of African region in the financial aspect, and what are the key, we can say, key countries which are playing a role in African region, stability of it, and even we can say the promoting African financial sector. So
Okay.
let's start from right now. Like, what's the situation in African region right now?
I would say Africa is very much on the rise. I've heard a lot of people, I think a lot of people that don't understand Africa would just think the place is chaos. But in my opinion, Africa is very much waking up and is very much on the rise. One reason, I think a lot of the Africans that left Africa from various countries over the years, they went to the United States, they went to Europe, they got educated, and now they're going home again. And they're taking back the knowledge that they picked up overseas to go back and develop things within their own countries. Powerhouses within Africa. I'm hearing very good things about Rwanda. And I know Americans that's looking at investing in Rwanda, buying houses in Rwanda. And Rwanda is meant to be very much a very organized, a very stable country. And I've only heard positives about Rwanda. One of the issues with Africa is you can have a stable country like Rwanda, but next door you can have a country that's destabilized like Democratic Republic of Congo. But the thing is, with the Democratic Republic of Congo, it itself could be a powerhouse because it's got so much resources. So again, there you got a big, how can we put it, a big contradiction between a stable country right next to a country that's pretty destable, but could be very, very rich. Other countries to watch out for, I think one that people should be watching out for a long time is Nigeria. Nigeria's got a lot of resources. It's got a large population, a very young and motivated population, and they get tarred with the wrong brush a lot of times because everybody thinks it's a criminal country, it's scammers, etc. Where most Nigerians are just hardworking people that want to get on. So I think that's a country that needs to be watched. Yes, they have a lot of corruption issues, but I think if you're following the media or the news in a lot of countries, it's becoming clear there's a lot of corruption even in the West, even in the United States, big time. In Europe, big time. So I think corruption is everywhere.
Yeah.
It's just a different type of corruption.
Okay, so that's a good point. I just wanted to highlight there are a few other countries apart from Congo and Nigeria which I feel are being overlooked. I would say South Africa has already been a powerhouse in
Yes.
African region. And they have been, I would say, now they're getting much more attraction because of another political issue. But in sense of financial sector, they have been a powerhouse in Africa for a very long time.
Yes.
And there are a few countries other than that as well. I believe Kenya has been a very positive in terms of tourism, and even Tanzania is now picking up. They are trying to attract a lot of investment. What is the link when it comes to, there is a lot of controversy when it comes to post-colonial era now, especially when it came to the French. And a few other African countries have been post-colonial from West side. So there has been a lot of resistance nowadays. And What is the aspect that you see over here when it comes to post-colonial era?
I think, well, my opinion, I don't think, this is my opinion. During the colonial era, the colonialists, that was mainly European, were European, exploited Africa to the max.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to do so. In some ways, what was left over, I think they've done their best to destabilize Africa and not stabilize Africa when they left. If you look at how Africa was divided, and this is one of the, I'd say this causes a lot of the problems. It was divided by the colonialists. The countries were made by the colonialists. So you've got countries that are, instead of being divided in a way which would benefit the Africans, it benefited the colonialists. So even if, and again, I've worked in like Nigeria, I've lived in Nigeria. Nigeria is split up, really, it should be split up on ethnic lines. But it wasn't split up on ethnic lines, it was split up the way the British wanted to split it up. So this is what causes a lot of the friction within Nigeria and other countries. There are some countries, and again, Uganda is one country where the ethnic lines seem to be okay. They've got control of the country. There doesn't seem to be that many problems within the country. I mentioned Rwanda earlier. We all know what happened in Rwanda how many years ago. But now the president, Kigali, has got it under control. Tanzania has been pretty free of problems at the moment. But again, just south of Tanzania, you've got issues within Mozambique. I think a lot of the issue, if you look what's happening over in West Africa, where the French have been asked to leave how many countries now? It's interesting to say when there was the coup in Niger and they asked the French to leave and the French got together there, we're going to remove the rebels, we're going to do this. None of that happened. Even though there was a lot of barking, it didn't happen. Because I think the African countries looked at this and saying, look, as far as France has been exploiting us for how many years now? And I think the president of Guinea-Bissau, a young guy, a military guy, I think he came out and summed it up perfectly. He said, we've been receiving French aid now for 65 years and we're still in poverty. So what's the point? We're better off going by ourselves and selling our resources at market prices, not at well under market prices to the French, because they're giving us a percentage back in aid. And I think a lot of in the post-colonial times, a lot of the colonialists are giving aid to Africa. They're saying, okay, here, take this money, but in the same time, still exploiting them for their resources. But I think Africa is waking up a lot.
Yeah, that's true. What about Somalia? I know that there is a lot of tension going on within Somalia, the civil war between Somalia and Somaliland. And I believe like there's a lot of internal civil unrest within a lot of African countries as well.
Somalia is an interesting country for me. I have associates there. And I think it's in a lot of people's interest to keep Somalia destabilized. Somalia, again, has a lot of resources. They've been trying to, how many people have bought fishing rights, etc. There's how many people there illegally fishing. In the north, they have gold, they have stones, they have minerals, but they tend to be these days in, I think the areas, I forget the names of the areas, they're controlled by Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. Somalia is another country with a lot of resources. If you look what's happening in Somalia, I think a lot of people, namely NGOs and government agencies and the United Nations, are making a lot of money from Somalia. Somalia is justifying their existence. Instead of going into Somalia and saying, okay, we're going to solve your problems, they're extending the problems. The only people that seem to be doing anything actively against Al-Shabaab, the Americans are taking actions due to drone strikes. Turkey's trying to help, but I would say a lot of the Western governments that's pumping money in there, they're just pumping money in there and it's kicking back to them. The NGOs are using it as an excuse just to make money. They're not doing anything really to benefit Somalia. Other countries, I think you've got a lot of instability throughout Africa, but again, it's Africa. Any problem can be solved if you want it to be solved. The problem is people don't want the problem solved because people are making money from the problems. Be it NGOs, be it aid agencies, be it people selling arms, munitions, etc., etc.
You talked about NGOs. I want to understand, this is something that has always baffled me, that the amount of money officially each NGO has declared that they have received, their revenue doesn't justify the amount of work that they have done.
Yeah, 100%.
Vis-a-vis it is Africa or any other region, it just doesn't justify.
What people don't realize, most NGOs are businesses. So again, you look at a lot of them, they're all tends to be based out, well, the big ones based out of Geneva, based out of Switzerland, which is an expensive country to start with. And before any money goes to the countries or goes to the causes, they got their operating costs. So their operating costs tend to be very luxurious offices. All their staff members are getting paid very, very well. And again, the money that gets through to the people that need it tends to be a small percentage. And some of my Somali associates said to me not so long ago, because we were looking at trying to get some business with NGOs, they said we don't want to deal with them. They had too many problems. And again, as far as they're concerned, it's haram to deal with them because the money they should be getting and going to the people is going in their pockets, is going on their living expenses. Their living expenses takes priority over to giving to the people and doing the jobs they should be doing.
Yeah. And in return, I feel like it is much more political than you can say like CSR, because I feel like the amount of connections NGOs have with political agencies and whatnot, it feels much more political dependency on each countries rather than helping out.
Well, where do the NGOs get their money from? A lot of these NGOs get their money from governments. So unless they're following the political lines of the governments that's giving them the money, they're not going to get the funding. They have to fall into place. If they're not falling into place, then they won't get the funding. They have to know people. They have to do as they're told. And that's how they get their funding.
One very interesting question that I wanted to ask you is, what is your opinion on how money has been spent from West compared to how China is investing in African region?
Well, China goes in and gets stuff done. They go in, they build infrastructure. Again, the trouble is with the Chinese, once they go into an area, they take everything. They're interested in resources. They're interested in business. But again, at the same time, they will go in and put things in place. I've heard good things about the Chinese. I've heard bad things about the Chinese. But I think the Chinese are a lot more straightforward than dealing with a lot of the Western governments. One of the big complaints I've heard from people I know, and one of the issues, I think this is where the West is shooting itself in the foot, especially the Americans and the European Union. They're going into places, and one thing they're pushing big time is gender issues and LGBTQ rights, etc. You know what? Most Africans aren't interested in that. To them, it's to me, what people do in private is up to them. It shouldn't become, people's sexuality shouldn't become a foreign policy issue. And by pushing this as a foreign policy issue, if you look what happened in Uganda, they got a lot of World Bank cut a lot of their loans, etc., because they brought in pretty strict laws against LGBTQ stuff, etc. I think Ghana's done the same. People don't want to hear that. People want to do business. The Chinese do business, whereas the West is pushing gender issues as part of its foreign policy instead of pushing business development and things like that. That's what's more important to people in Africa than what people do in private. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I feel this is one of the topics which Russia was raising as well. Like, we don't want this kind of narratives to be pushed on our kids, right?
Yeah, 100%.
And this is something that he has been a great advocate for. Yeah. And what about the religious aspect? I feel like African nations are quite active in religious aspect as well, same as Asia. In Asia, religion is a really strong topic, and they are quite, you can say, like, determined about how people push the narrative when it comes to religious views, and they can get very aggressive when their religious views are threatened. And same as Africa,
Yeah.
I've realized, I've heard a lot of stories where African nations, I mean, people from Africa, they have literally killed people on the basis of religion.
100%. You mentioned South Africa. South Africa is a very diverse country. And again, Africans are very religious people. In South Africa, okay, you've got a very large Muslim community. You've got a very large Hindu community. And again, you've got a very large Christian community. And at some point, yes, they get along to some extent. But again, at times there is friction. If you're talking about, again, I think Kenya's got a very large Muslim community, Christian community. And again, everybody interacts, everybody does business. Nigeria, there's friction in Nigeria because the north is mainly Muslim, the south is Christian, etc. So, and again, it's like you have to take into consideration whenever you're doing business in places, the people's culture, the people's religion, and you have to respect that. And I think this is one issue with the globalists. I'll use the word globalist for the West. They don't respect that. They're going in pushing their views, which are, again, can be insulting to a lot of religious people from all religions. And again, they're not taking that into consideration. They're going into areas and just blatantly insulting people.
That's true. How do you see future of Africa in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the key aspects that you feel are going to be dictating Africa's future?
I think something that happened recently was a big step for Africa in general. And that was when South Africa took Israel to the International Criminal Court for the issues in Gaza.
Yeah.
And that, to me, again, politics aside, it doesn't matter which side you agree with or disagree with. Politics aside, that's a big step for Africa because Africa's finding its voice. And Africa's actually coming onto the world scene now saying, look, you've been criticizing us for how many years? For corruption, for this, for that, for everything else. It's like, hold on a minute. You people have got faults as well. We have a voice. If you look again, what happened in West Africa where the French have been asked to leave. Okay, Africa's had enough. Goodbye. They're finding their strength. They're finding their voice. And they're beginning to realize, you know what, we have the resources. And I think you're going to see more of that in the next 5 to 10 years where African countries will become more independent. And I think they're going to start leaning more towards the BRICS countries rather than the West.
Yeah. That begs the question, what's the future for BRICS when it comes to Africa?
I think there's going to be more African countries joining BRICS. Why? Because BRICS is fresh. BRICS is something new. It'll be more appealing to the African countries, especially if they sort out their own currency, etc., etc. I think one issue with a lot of people these days, which has been highlighted with the US sanctioning Russia and sanctioning everybody else, is most countries in the world are dependent on the SWIFT system for banking. If you upset the US, if you upset the World Bank, if you're blocked from using the SWIFT system, your banking sector is screwed up. The only country that seems up to now seems to be able to get around that are the Somalis, which have their own banking system, Somali banking. Yeah. But again, everybody else is dependent on that to do business. And I think if BRICS sort out an alternative system, I think there's some, I seen the other day, I didn't pay attention to which country. I think some countries now are beginning to, it could be Central African Republic, are using the MIR system, which is the Russian system. So again, I think we're going to see a lot of change over the next few years. And I think if the West wants to keep up, they need to be a lot more open-minded because I think BRICS has a lot more to offer Africa than the West. And the trouble is with the West has got a bad reputation in a lot of African countries due to the colonial era.
After a short break, I think our last question that I was asking you was about that. What are the other opportunities that African countries can have especially when we consider that the option of Russia, China, or West, if we just remove them and see other options, what would that? What could they be?
I think this is what a lot of African countries are looking at. And I think there's opportunities for African countries to be independent. Whereas in the past, they've always looked towards the West, or like you say, China, Russia, etc. Why not look towards other African countries, pull the resources, and then push their services out to the rest of the world? They have the resources. The rest of the world is dependent on Africa for electric cars, cell phones, etc. Everybody's dependent on the Congo for cobalt. So I think it would make sense for these countries that have the resources to say, okay, you need us, we don't need you. And again, I think that's a big change in mindset, which we're possibly going to see in the next 5 to 10 years. Because again, I tell people these days, and a lot of people don't like it, especially the Europeans, it's like, okay, what resources does Europe have? Nothing. What resources do most African countries have? They have coffee, they have tea, they have minerals, they have gold, they have most things that people need. And this is why the colonial countries have been exploiting for Africa for how many years? Because they have the resources. The world needs Africa. Africa doesn't need the world. It just needs to realize that.
I always believe that for any country to actually progress or get out of their comfort zone, you always need a leader. You need a leader who is vocal, who is ready to bring a change. And I feel like Africa is a country where you need leaders as well. Do you see any leader coming out of African region who you feel like, okay, this is the guy who can actually change the whole system, like this person can actually bring Africa back to its glory days?
I think the trouble is, I think there's quite a few people. If you look again, the Rwandan president, the South Africans are finding more of a voice. They've been calling out a few people lately, as we mentioned earlier. They've been vocal. The trouble is, will people allow any African leader that wants to make a change to actually get into power? If you look at what Gaddafi wanted to do, an African currency, a powerful Africa, and look what happened to him. So this is where are people going to allow, our outside forces going to allow in the short term for there to be a powerful African leader that's going to unite Africa and say, okay, you're now dependent on us. If you look in Nigeria, you got, I forget the guy's name now, Dayango. They're building the richest guy in Nigeria. They're building the first oil refinery in Nigeria, even though Nigeria's got plenty of oil, it's been dependent on other people to refine that oil, which is pretty crazy. So again, there's plenty of voices within Africa. They just need to come to the front and allowed to become to the front and allowed to actually get into leadership positions and start pushing the African narrative rather than following what other people want them to follow.
I've been traveling to a lot of Asian countries and West as well. I've lived in Malaysia for almost 12 years and all. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I've realized, especially in Asian region, Central Asian region, and I have a lot of African friends, so I've got to know them culturally a little bit as well. I feel like they all possess a similar kind of cultural, you can say like theology within themselves, cultural lifestyle, and a level of acceptance, So do you feel like that cultural acceptance could be an hindrance towards the development of African region as well?
No, I think what the hindrance is, again, I say this to people about projects. I think I touched on it earlier. You have to understand people's cultures to be able to do business with them, successful business. And I think a lot of what's been happening with Africa, other cultures are going in there expecting Africans to work to fit in with their culture, rather than doing things the way that's more suited towards African culture. So this is where, if you're looking at training projects, my business security, and one guy I was talking to a while back said to me, they were doing some military training project in West Africa. And they were laughing, saying, well, the guys they were training, I'm not going to mention the country, they couldn't do press-ups. A lot of the Western stuff, which is usual to kids in the West, these Africans didn't understand. And I said to him, well, why would they need to do stuff like press-ups? It's not part of their culture. If you ask them to go and farm or fish or do something like that, I'm sure they'd be able to do it very, very well. So this is where I think understanding how things are done in Africa and adapting business proposals, business plans, project plans, etc., towards that culture and planning them around that culture rather than going in with, how can I put it, perspectives from the outside and expecting other people to adapt to your perspectives. That's how things can be done in Africa to make sure things work. If that makes sense. You have to have that
definitely.
African perspective.
Before we end our conversation, yeah, that's true. Before we end our conversation, what are the main, you can say like, what are the main things that Africa can provide to an outside investor? Like if I'm an investor and I want to venture into Africa, what are the key aspects that I should be looking into when considering where to go and what to invest in?
Africa is a large population. And at the moment with Africa, a lot of African countries and a lot of the Africans I deal with are saying this, is like very little is produced in Africa. If an investor's going in, they want to be looking at places where they can actually produce products for the local market. If they can produce products for the local market, then there's a huge potential. I think the only country that's making cars in Africa is South Africa. Most countries produce food for their local markets. They don't export. So if you could, somebody was saying to me, a huge market would be camel milk, which is very expensive. If you could start drying camel milk and exporting camel milk, it'd be a huge business. But at this point, there may be one person doing it on a very, very small scale. So going in and investing and looking, instead of exporting your investment, keeping it within the local regions, there's a huge market for that. It's just people need to go in and deal with the challenges and develop things.
Yeah, that's true. Any progress with the IT and all? Because I know there are a lot of IT related companies moving in towards Africa also.
Well, everybody in Africa has a smartphone, right? I think to sort out an African Facebook or that type of thing would make big money. The trouble is, and this is one of the issues with Africa and IT in general, is infrastructure. And if we can use Nigeria as an example, one of the big problems there, which is something we're looking at, is power. I think the whole of the Nigerian power grid went down a couple of weeks ago. So these countries need to sort out their infrastructure. If they sort out the infrastructure, then the potential for IT and everything else is huge.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you so much, Orlando. I really appreciate it. I know it was a big trouble for you, especially considering you are not in the city center at the moment and you're traveling as well. So I really appreciate you giving me time and plenty of time actually, and sorting out all the technical stuff as well. I really appreciate it. And good luck for your new project. And let's keep in touch for our next show. I'm sure like that will be quite an interesting one as well.
I'll try to be somewhere a little bit more, I'm not going to say civilized, a little bit more technically advanced than where I am at the moment. Okay.
Thank you so much, Orlando. I really appreciate it. Have a nice day, man.
Take care, mate.
Thank you. Cheers.